Hey, what's up, everyone? Where we begin this fireside chat with an aggressive take on the last couple of decades of American history. We're going to blitz through these, and some of this may even cross over into some of the topics that were covered in our student presentations, which were exciting to get started today. So I'm going to begin with the 1970s. I'm going to kind of break things down into a couple different segments, and from here, this content is all relevant to the comp exam. And so I think that this will offer you guys just a good perspective on everything. So let's start with the 1970s, and let's pick up where we kind of left off with Vietnam and the theme of disillusionment. The United States people had felt severely mistreated and misrepresented by the government in the way that the Vietnam War played out. And so the United States people kind of looked at the government with a sense of failure, that the government had really steered the country wrong in the Vietnam War. But when we look at post-Vietnam War, the situation didn't get any better. And with the United States government, I can't put it any other way, things just got a whole heck of a lot worse. And that specifically is referring to the Watergate Scandal. And Watergate may go down in American history as the most shocking presidential and government scandal of all time. Those are all arguable, but the point being, what happened with Watergate was a classic case of, in this instance, the classic case of lying. And the issue here at stake was that President Richard Nixon, who was elected in 1968 and kind of steered the United States out of the Vietnam War, President Nixon was up for re-election in 1972. Nixon was considered a shoo-in, meaning he should have won the election very easily. However, members of Nixon's re-election committee, people that were tasked with helping to get the president reelected, some members of that committee were found to be arrested after breaking into the Democratic National Convention headquarters at the Watergate offices in Washington, D.C., the hotel and offices. So members of Nixon's re-election team, people that were working to help spread information and campaign for Nixon, members of that organization were found to have been arrested. They were arrested for breaking into the Democrats' National Party office. News of the break-in gets out, and at first, this seemed like just a strange coincidence. But for months, muckraking journalists from all over the country, especially the Washington Post, the newspaper in D.C., really put a lot of effort into bringing out information about the story, specifically two reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. Woodward and Bernstein were two reporters that worked on this story, and as did other newspapers. But the point is, muckraking journalists dug deep into the Watergate break-in, and what they found was that these men who had been arrested for breaking into the Democrats' office actually had ties to the White House. They worked for the White House in other capacities, and in the end, it was, through, again, months of investigation, months of research in the newspapers and whatnot, it was uncovered that these men were actually getting paid by the White House. They were on the White House's payroll. And so what soon starts to come to light, and I'm watering this down, so I'm just bear with me, but what soon comes to light is the fact of the matter was that Nixon and members of his government denied having anything to do with the break-in. They kept denying. Nixon had his famous speech in front of the American people on television where he said, "I'm not a crook." And Nixon denied his involvement in the scandal. But the FBI was hot on the trail. And the FBI was investigating the Watergate break-in, as were the newspapers. And ultimately, the FBI had a secret source within the FBI was feeding the newspapers information for them to release this information about the case to the public, which is against the law. But the FBI agent did this secretly. And ultimately, with the FBI's investigation, plus the Washington Post and other newspapers' investigations, what was discovered is that Nixon had admitted on secret tapes that were recorded in the White House. Nixon was caught on tape revealing that he was aware of the break-in, that he was aware that the men that were involved were being paid by the White House. And Nixon admitted on the tapes that he wanted, just nothing to do with this, get rid of it, get rid of the problem. And these tapes were the damning evidence that would really lead to Nixon's ultimate resignation. The tapes, in fact, this is even crazier. The tapes, Nixon and the White House tried to sue to block the tapes from being released. And there was a mysterious 16 minutes of the tapes, by the way, that were deleted. So who knows what was on those 16 minutes? There could have been more information about Nixon's involvement. But once the public got wind of these tapes, that was it for Nixon. He had lost all public confidence. And Nixon was headed towards impeachment, without a doubt. He was on a one-way track to impeachment. And in order to avoid impeachment, Nixon resigned. And it's well regarded that Nixon would have no doubt been impeached and probably convicted if he had gone on to facing impeachment. So he chose to resign in 1973 after the Watergate. 1974. Nixon resigned after the Watergate scandal broke. So you're thinking, right, that this means there's going to be another accidental president. And in fact, there is. Because with Nixon's resignation, which, by the way, is the only time in American history that a president resigned. That's the only time that this ever happened. Nixon resigns, and ultimately, his vice president, well, it gets even crazier. Nixon's vice president was Gerald Ford. And Gerald Ford had only become vice president when a previous vice president, Spiro Agnew, had resigned. So this just got really hairy, really dicey. Nixon's on his way out. He was, in fact, lying. And ultimately, Nixon would be the first American president to resign. And Gerald Ford has the notoriety of becoming the first American president to take office. Ford took office without ever being elected president or vice president. That's a pretty good dinner party knowledge fact right there. So what's the takeaway from Watergate? Why is it important? Well, it continued in the narrative of the American government losing trust in its people. Watergate was a shock. It was disturbing to people that the country had fallen again on hard times. And this is a long line of presidential scandals that we've discussed, going back to Grant with the whiskey ring and the Credit Mobilier scandal, Teapot Dome during Warren Harding's presidency. But now Watergate trumps them all. And Watergate was the biggest scandal and maybe remaining the biggest scandal in presidential history. And again, it leads to the only time in American history where a president resigned. But the continuation of the disillusionment would go on. Ford had his hands full with trying to restore public confidence in the government. In fact, Ford's presidency was rather unremarkable. Things that happened with Ford's presidency, one of the biggest was the economy collapsed. There was a massive economic collapse in the 1970s, and that was tied to oil. What happened in the 1970s, the United States had become more and more dependent on foreign oil. And as a result of that, the United States was victim when in 1973, members of the OPEC, which is the oil petroleum organization that controls the output of oil from mostly Middle Eastern states. When the Middle Eastern states that controlled most of the oil production decided to raise prices, this affected the whole entire world. And the American economy really was hit hard by the oil prices going way up. There were famous gas lines at gas stations. People couldn't get gas for their cars. Transportation was slowed to a halt. This had a really crippling effect on the American economy. We're also dealing with what some of the groups today presented. The American economy was hit hard and people were moving to the West. East Coast cities were losing people and jobs. So the American economy under Ford really was hit hard. And there's one term I want to give you about the American economy in the 1970s that, again, this contributed to the disillusionment that the people had. And that is stagnation. Stagnation is the idea when your economy's growth is stagnant, meaning it's not growing. And then you have inflation, which is the rising prices. So combine stagnation and inflation, and you get stagflation, a term that was coined about the 1970s in the United States. So Ford's presidency was really met by economic crisis, and then that led to, in 1976, Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, being elected over Ford. So Ford lost the 1976 election to Jimmy Carter, and Jimmy Carter's presidency continued to have the problems that the previous administrations had done. The economy was still getting hit hard. The oil prices remained high. The Iranian Hostage Crisis happened during Carter's presidency when Iran overthrew its government and rejected Western and American ideals in a big way. That was a huge stain and questioned people's confidence in the American government. And the other issue that I would say to be aware of with Carter, one of the other big issues with Carter was the Cold War. One thing going on in the 1970s, the Cold War was going through a thawing period, meaning the tensions between the Soviet Union, China, and the United States were diminishing. And this is a word that actually comes from the French to mean like cool off. And that was détente, D-E-T-E-N-T-E, détente. Détente is a term that comes from the Cold War in the 1970s when the United States and the Soviet Union and China were diminishing the tensions. So tensions were cooling off, or I should say heating up because it's the Cold War. So know that word, détente. It's an important word of the 1970s. It's definitely a word that you want to take into your vocabulary here, your historical vocabulary. But to recap, the 1970s were really a period in time in American history where disillusionment reigned supreme. From Vietnam to Watergate to the stagflation of the economic crisis, the oil embargo, which led to higher prices with the oil industry and the Sun Belt migrations, and then, of course, Carter with the Iranian Hostage Crisis. All these factors were contributing to a disillusioned country, a country that no longer had the faith and confidence that it was a world superpower. And the 1980s, when we get into the 1980s and we start hearing presentations on Ronald Reagan and his presidencies and the changes in the 1980s, the 80s are going to be all about America getting its swag back, for lack of a better term. America's going to try to bounce back in the 1980s because the 70s are one of the most troubling eras in American history. So as long as you can keep that in mind and apply that theme to other questions that you see on tests, I think you should be good to go on the 1970s. So I'll leave you guys with that. I finished under 15 minutes, which is a good thing for you. This is it for homework. Have those presentations ready this weekend. And as always, the past shapes the future. Take care, everyone.